a mentor who also functions as a sounding board to me. Every time I have any trouble, I can just call him, and he gives me very brilliant advice with his experience of having worked in Israel, in USA. He's a medical oncologist working in Rabin Medical Center, but recently he has moved into a more policy maker type of role, which he calls translating policy academic work into real impact through Clalit Health Services in Israel. He is also an adjunct associate professor in University of North Carolina. He was previously at Emory University. I met Dan maybe 8 years ago through Twitter, something Dr. Booth has no idea what it's about. And since then, we started to become good friends, and we started meeting at ASCO meetings. And Dan has been publishing very important papers related to pharmacoeconomics. He did a number of cost effectiveness studies that literally, in a sense, killed a drug. I think he'll talk about it as well. This is a drug called Nacitumab in lung cancer. And he has done several very key important papers in cancer policy. And his recent interest has been on interventional pharmacoeconomics. And I think he will explain more about it in his talk. But it's my big pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Goldstein to our Queen's Cancer Research Institute seminar series. And I'm very excited to listen to what he has to say. Thank you, Dan, for accepting our invitation. And the podium is yours. The virtual podium is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So first of all, Bishal, I thank you greatly for the invitation. It's when Bishal asked me to do something, I immediately say yes. It's a great honor. I'm sure you all know in Kingston what a privilege it is that you managed to capture this rising star, that I actually take pride in the fact that I spotted him when he was just starting to rise on Twitter. And Bishal, it was a really great honor to be your friend, and maybe I advised you in the past, but you now advise me. So thank you. So so Bishal asked me, he said, can you talk about interventional pharmacoeconomics and anything else of interest? So I thought, well, okay, fine, I'll do exactly that. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and talk about interventional pharmacoeconomics for the first half, and then I'm going to add some stuff at the end, which is a bit more philosophical, which I think is really interesting, and that's what interests me, as well as the nitty-gritty of the way we give drugs, the dosages and everything else. But we're going to talk about more technical stuff first. Now, what we already know, Bishal mentioned that I've done a lot of work on regular pharmacoeconomics. I've done a lot of work on cost effectiveness, budget impact studies. I take perhaps some credit for killing Nacitumab, one of the kind of emblematic problems of modern oncology, a drug that extended life expectancy of overall survival by 6 weeks. And through different strategies, we've basically killed the drug. But I'm not going to talk about any of that, because what we already know, and I'm sure you hear this from Dr. Booth and from Bishal all the time, that cancer drugs are often expensive, often poor value, and often unaffordable. And that's the basic education you need to come to this lecture before going any further. And we have a problem. So the question is, and that's what I spent a lot of, from probably 2013 to 2018 studying this and understanding it. And this is basically the conclusion that I came to. Then the question is, how do we find solutions? Now, there's different ways to improve the situation. One is we can make drugs cheaper. We can say to the drug company, can you lower your price, please? Often that doesn't happen unless you've got some leverage on them. So that doesn't always work. Two, we can be wealthier. We can be a wealthier country. We can have more money individually. Sometimes easier said than done. Or we can increase the drug efficacy, only give the drugs to the patients who are really going to gain the benefit from the drugs. Or we can change legislation. There's a classic problem in the US of drugs that are approved by the FDA are based only on efficacy and safety, no looking at cost. And then the Medicare has to provide them by law. That's a problem that needs to be fixed, and hopefully it will be fixed at some point. We can make the regulatory process more efficient. I'm not sure how much impact that would genuinely have. Or one of the things that we can do is make medical interventions. Now, all of the previous things are important. They're all crucial, particularly like trying to decrease the cost of drugs, etc. They're all important, but I've chosen to focus my past couple of years on this notion of what we call making medical interventions in order to decrease our expenditure and improve the situation. So this is a paper that I wrote together with Mark Ratain, who's my close partner in crime from the University of Chicago, together with Alan Lichter, a previous CEO of ASCO, a couple of years ago. And in it, we basically describe what we're calling this new field, interventional pharmacoeconomics. And in this, there are 4 strategies. There's therapeutic substitution, changing one drug for another. There's giving lower dosages. There's giving less frequent dosing, or there's giving a shorter duration of treatment. We're going to look at each of these and look at some examples of each of these and how to do it. And the big aim is identifying drugs that we can do this with while maintaining efficacy of the drugs. So let's go through this one by one and see some examples of what we can do. First of all, if you're interested in this, you want to listen to more people, don't just want to listen to me, but you want to hear some other people. We had our first interventional summit on interventional pharmacoeconomics, which was supposed to be in Israel. It was supposed to be in March 2020, but obviously COVID closed that down, and we had our first one on Zoom. So all of the lectures are all available on the ASCO Post website if you want to find some other lectures to look at. They're really interesting. So here are the strategies. So first of all, let's talk about therapeutic substitution. As we know, there's a number of examples, but one example is paclitaxel and nab-paclitaxel. Paclitaxel was the old story of the bark off the Pacific yew tree, and then along came nab-paclitaxel, which was different. It was without the chromophore, which caused the infusion reactions from the paclitaxel. And this nab-paclitaxel was considered to be superior because it have less infusion reactions and possibly also greater efficacy. So from this, there were some trials that were done, but not paclitaxel compared to nab-paclitaxel, but just when they wanted to partner a taxane with any other drug, they would give nab-paclitaxel instead. And so it was considered that it was better, and it was used in breast cancer initially. Maybe in other cancers also, until this paper, which I consider to be a hugely important paper in the field, which was published in JCO and showed that nab-paclitaxel was not superior to paclitaxel in terms of efficacy in breast cancer. This was a crucial thing because the cost of paclitaxel is far, far less than nab-paclitaxel, given that it's now generic. Now, one of the main indications for nab-paclitaxel these days is in metastatic pancreas cancer, based on this trial by Von Hoff et al., showing this benefit of gemcitabine plus nab-paclitaxel compared to gemcitabine, and this is in use in many countries now. The question, though, is, given the fact that we already know that paclitaxel is equivalent to nab-paclitaxel in breast cancer, wouldn't that also be the case in metastatic pancreas cancer? And it's an important question. But unfortunately, we don't exactly have completely definitive evidence to answer that question because no trial has been done. Unfortunately, there's no financial incentive for the makers of generic paclitaxel to run such a trial, given the cost of paclitaxel. But I would argue that in resource-poor settings, if you really wanted to give a taxane plus gemcitabine in metastatic pancreas cancer, I would argue that it would be reasonably sufficient to replace the nab-paclitaxel or paclitaxel. Other examples of therapeutic substitution. There's many other examples where you can choose. You can say, is there a class effect in proton pump inhibitors, statins, ACE inhibitors? This is an issue of class effect where there's work on class effect. There's a kind of pivotal paper in JAMA 20 years ago defining what is needed in order to state that there is a class effect in drugs. But once you do see a class effect, potentially you can swap them in and out. Maybe that's possible with checkpoint inhibitors today. Maybe it's possible with other drugs. Perhaps the PARP inhibitors exhibit a class effect. Perhaps all of the androgen receptor blockers in prostate cancer exhibit class effect criteria. And then it's in effect possible to do what's called a price war or tendering and go to each company and say, we're a large insurer, which we think that these are a class effect. We will put only one of them on formulary, give us your cheapest price, and it moves from there. Now, then there's other examples of sirolimus and everolimus. Everolimus obviously being the more expensive drug, efficacy not that great and quite toxic, but sirolimus is generic and used in transplant medicine, but also considered to be a reasonable substitution. Now, the classic example of this, what we call therapeutic substitution, comes from the field of ophthalmology. And this is in age-related macular degeneration with VEGF inhibition. Some of you may know about this story, but what happened was that bevacizumab or Avastin was in development and was a VEGF drug. And the trials were developing, and then it got approved. But meanwhile, there were trials going on first of all, I don't remember if it was first in breast or colon cancer. But meanwhile, they knew that VEGF inhibition was likely to be effective in macular degeneration as well, but created a different agent, Ranibizumab. For some biological reasons, it was preferred to give it in this way because it was a smaller molecule in order to get it into the eye. In 2004, the FDA approved bevacizumab for cancer at this dose, 5 mg per kg. But meanwhile, the trials were ongoing in eye disease, but people had heard about the efficacy in the eye disease trials. So some kind of individual ophthalmologists went and took a little bit of drugs out of the vials from the oncology departments, injected them into the eyes of their patients, and saw that they worked really well just using bevacizumab. And so then they started using it and realized that it worked well, but the dosage that was required was just a tiny, tiny amount of bevacizumab in order to get the required effect. So as a result of this, there was then a publicly funded trial comparing these two drugs. It was published in the New England Journal, and the comparison of the different drugs was $2,000 versus $50 per dose. So as a result, there was a movement in the eye community to actually use bevacizumab instead of ranibizumab, to the kind of anger of the company that was marketing the drug. And the amount of money saved from this therapeutic substitution was vast. They estimate in the US there was $17 billion saved by using bevacizumab instead of ranibizumab, and 3.5 billion were direct savings to patients, so reducing individual patient financial toxicity, which I think is remarkable that they managed to do this. Now, what happened next? It's obvious story, kind of cat and mouse, that the public institutions did this. It went around the world. In the UK, they were doing it. They were doing it in Israel as well. But then, obviously, the drug companies weren't happy. They sued the health providers, even the NHS. They sued, but ultimately the NHS won the legal suit and saying that it's okay to give Avastin because it was perfectly safe and effective. So that's therapeutic substitution. Now, there's many other examples. Now let's talk about lower dosages. So there are 4 stages of pharmacokinetics. I can't remember too much of this pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and then started studying more deeply a few years ago and trying to remember how all this works. But let's focus on absorption. So there are many oral drugs where the absorption varies depending on if you eat it with a meal or not. So this was what was called, what Mark and Ezra Cohen wrote about. This is now quite an aged article. It was 13 years ago about lepatinib, and showing that the labeled dosage of lepatinib is 5 tablets, but fasting. But if you take it with a meal or a high-fat meal, you can take 2 tablets and gain the same effect. Now, this concept can then be spread to other things. So this is a trial that is quite well known about now in prostate cancer, which is for abiraterone. And abiraterone is standard to be given 1,000 milligrams without food. However, it is known that it would probably be sufficient based on the PK data to give a quarter of the dosage, but with food. So this was a trial that Russell Smulowitz from the University of Chicago, together with Mark Retain and a number of collaborators around the world, ran this trial looking at the efficacy. and showing that essentially the PSA change with using the 2 dosages is the same. Now, the question is, and we're going to talk about a little bit more about this, this was the endpoint of the trial, PSA change from baseline. Is this endpoint sufficient? Now, obviously, you know, this is a surrogate endpoint, and I know when Vishal is in the audience, a surrogate endpoint is an evil word, and we want to see overall survival. So here, would this be sufficient for you to change the treatment, even though you don't have overall survival, because there's still some level of uncertainty here? Perhaps it wouldn't be sufficient to incorporate this strategy in a place where money is no object, because if money is no object, although no such place exists, then why would you give a lower dose and take the uncertainty? Whereas if you're in a place which is a resource constrained setting such as India, then you know a small amount of statistical uncertainty is probably acceptable in order to save 3/4 of the costs. And indeed, that is in fact what seems to be happening, in that in the USA, this strategy hasn't been taken up, you know, with open arms. Whereas in India, the reports that we're hearing is that this strategy is used pretty much, well, in many places, as far as we understand. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about these, you know, levels of evidence. So, which other drugs have potential for, other oral cancer drugs have potential for savings? So, there's many other oral drugs, and this was by Mark Rutain and Alan Lichter. They kind of looked at all the drugs to see where there's opportunity, and saw that the 62% of oral cancer drugs have opportunities for reducing the prescribing costs, with an estimate of the potential annual global savings at $12 billion US. And those are the big drugs where the savings could be made. Now, let's go to less frequent dosing. And we'll talk a little bit about a few different drugs here. So here's zoledronic acid, showing that it used to be given every 4 weeks, but then they tested it to see what happens if we give it every 12 weeks instead of every 4 weeks, and saw the same levels of first SREs. And essentially, as a result of this, I think the practice has changed to giving it every 3 months instead. But then along comes Denosumab, and obviously with all the marketing, it's got a nice new mechanism. It must be better if it has a nice new mechanism. New mechanism means better survival, better efficacy, sure. But obviously we don't always believe that. And sometimes new mechanisms don't necessarily provide an improvement. So Denosumab it tried to enter the market in various different areas of osseous disease. So first of all, here was the trial using it, comparing it to zoledronic acid in breast cancer. And this was a superiority trial, designed as a superiority trial, showing a superior percentage of patients without SREs. Overall survival was unchanged, but then here it is in myeloma, but this was a non-inferiority trial. So then it tried to be marketed as a non-inferiority trial. So Denosumab is non-inferior to zoledronic acid. So then, what if it's, let's say, 20 times the price? Why should it be used instead of zoledronic acid at a lower price? There was an argument that, oh, maybe it's a little bit easier because you don't have to adjust the dosage for kidney function, and some nuances in there. But my conclusion, based on this data from myeloma, was that only a very small proportion of patients with Denosumab would actually require with myeloma would actually require Denosumab instead of zoledronic acid. So then the question it becomes superiority, or an example of superiority versus non-inferiority trials. Let's move on from here, and this is a paper that's kind of received quite a lot of attention since it was published a few months ago by Ian Tannock, together with myself and Mark Retain and then Saltz and a bunch of people, and trying to really dig deep into this issue of evidence required to support these alternative cost-effective treatments. So on the one hand, in the past, we don't like using surrogate endpoints. We want to see overall survival benefit when a new drug comes along. We want to see, we don't want to just rely on response rates or pathologic complete responses or other surrogate endpoints when new drugs are coming along. However, when older drugs, when expensive drugs, we're trying to find a more cost-effective strategy, we're suggesting in this paper that actually we should be accepting lower levels of evidence in order to use such strategies. And that we shouldn't always require a 2,000 patient non-inferiority trial in order to introduce a new treatment or a cheaper, more cost-effective treatment. So one example of this is in breast cancer in 6 months of Herceptin, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But if you take an example, let's say we took the example of Clalit, where I live, where we have 5 million insurees, and we currently give 1 year of Herceptin, and we do a trial. Let's say it was only a small trial, not with overall survival, but with response rate or even PFS or disease-free survival, and we see that 6 months looks pretty much equivalent. We haven't done a massive non-inferiority. It's kind of, you know, wide non-inferiority margins. It's not statistically robust the way these massive non-inferiority trials are. But it looks the same, and it makes sense that it's the same. And then if you think about if we were only to give 6 months of Herceptin to all of these many patients, how much money we would then have saved, and how that money could then be redistributed for other services. It might even be for geriatrics or psychiatric care or any other services, and how to redistribute that money. And the overall impact is most likely a net health positive benefit, as long as that money is appropriately redistributed. Sometimes it wouldn't be redistributed, it would just be reducing the premiums and the co-pays, et cetera, which are also important. But the net health benefit, when you look at it from a populational perspective, is important to consider. So even if we don't have perfect evidence, it may be justifiable to move forward with these strategies. So the dosing of pembrolizumab is another example, and this is what many people know me for from my work on pembrolizumab. And it was labeled initially at 2 milligrams per kilogram every 3 weeks. And then the company changed the strategy to giving it a fixed dosing every 3 weeks. However, we realized, hold on a minute, the average patient weighs only 75 kilos, so would require only 150 milligrams. And we know the efficacy is the same if you're giving fixed dosing or weight-based dosing. So therefore, we did a budget impact study calculating how much you could save in the US. And obviously, it's a large number, almost $1 billion annually, if we went back to weight-based dosing. And that was only in first-line PD-L1 positive lung cancer. So that number will be much higher now once you incorporate all of the other indications. However, it's complicated because the company used to provide 50 milligram vials and 100 milligram vials. However, when they moved to fixed dosing, they removed the 50 milligram vials from the market, making it more difficult to give weight-based dosing. So, and you would also need to do vial sharing, which some consider it's not possible to do vial sharing. So we actually looked closely at some of these issues related to vial sharing and identified that in order to do vial sharing and get this saving, it's more reasonable to expect it to happen in a closed healthcare system, somewhere like the VA or Kaiser, because they would have an incentive to share vials. In a classic US setting where patients are insured by many different healthcare payers or insurance companies, it would be difficult to figure out how to do that vial sharing. There's also a financial disincentive in the US to do vial sharing. This is the JW modifier, which pays for wastage. Even if there's wastage left over in a vial, that money can be reclaimed back. So it disincentivizes any sharing of vials. There's also some issues related to drug stability and sterility. When you look on the labels of these drugs, pembrolizumab says it can be kept for 24 hours refrigerated. Trastuzumab says it can be kept for 28 days. Some of these amounts have then been studied further. There was a paper from Korea, I think, and a few different places, realizing that actually the stability is far beyond what it says on the label. And actually, the label is like that often because the FDA requires them only to study the stability or sterility, stability really, for 24 hours. And as long as they can say 24 hours is fine, they don't need to study any further. So that's what ends up on the label. But the reality is that they can be kept in the fridge for much longer. Another strategy is group infusions on specific days of the week. So is vial sharing possible with single-use vials? The cautious and risk-averse approach is no, we don't want any sharing of vials. There could be a possible risk of infection or cross-contamination, and we don't want any single-use vial. We don't want any sharing. But the more cost-conscious would say, yeah, the risk of infection, the risk of any problem is very low. Let's do it carefully. And then the money that we save will have a net health positive impact. So kind of looking at it with a big picture perspective, recognizing that there is a safety concern, but trying to do whatever we can to mitigate it in order to have an efficient strategy. And I would add here that, you know, I'm all in favor of safety and prevention of errors in medicine, completely in favor of it. And I think it's a really crucial thing that needs to be focused on very much in our hospitals all around the world. However, sometimes this, this notion gets pushed too strongly. And when you really think about the level of risk and what the trade-off would be, sometimes focusing only on safety is not always the most important thing. And sometimes I would suggest that possibly it sometimes gets hijacked and pushed by the manufacturer of the drug in order to push a specific agenda that they have. Let's skip this. We'll skip this for now. I like skipping once in a while. Canada, so I don't need to tell you, but you're actually the leaders in the world with regard to implementation of weight-based dosing of checkpoint inhibitors. So this was a kind of white paper from CADTH published a few years ago, which was 50 pages long and contained everything that needed to be checked, looking at if we should use weight-based dosing instead of fixed dosing, or if you should use it. And as a result of this, my colleague Kelvin Chan, who I'm sure many of you know, gave me some of this information for a talk that I gave previously, and showed that basically weight-based dosing has been implemented widely across Canada. I'm sure you know better than me, but some provinces do it slightly differently, but it's widely implemented. And actually gave us the kind of support in order for us in Israel to try to implement the policy in Israel, where the Israeli regulators were much more cautious and didn't want to do anything, you know, we must go stay by the FDA label, we must do what the FDA says, even though they don't support weight-based dosing based on the label. But because you guys in Canada had gone forward and done it, it gave us support. So we had a personal victory here in Israel a few months ago, or a month ago, I think, after a long, hard, arduous regulatory battle with regulators as well as clinicians, as well as the pharmaceutical company from behind pulling different strings. But we finally convinced the Ministry of Health that this was a reasonable strategy, and they basically allowed us to go forward. But if the vial sharing is an issue, can we think about changing the dosing frequency instead of using full vials? Because it's complicated to do vial sharing. So what about just giving the fixed dose of 200 milligrams, but changing the frequency? So if you look at the PK data for pembrolizumab, you can really see different details of that give support to the fact that we can actually give these drugs with much longer intervals. And these are some of the PK data from the company itself that was submitted to the FDA for some of their approvals, showing that you can actually spread out the dosing. This is the paper we wrote about nivolumab, and I find this is just fascinating. So the drug, there was a phase 2 trial. I'm showing you the phase 2 trial first, which is a mistake. This was the phase 1 trial. And in the phase 1 trial, they did dose escalation at 0.1 mg per kg, 0.3, 1, 3, and showed basically the same level of responses across the board. Obviously small numbers, so you can't draw any firm conclusions. But what they also did was they took the patients who didn't respond to the drug with the low doses of 0.1 and 0.3 and dose escalated them to 3 to see if once their dose escalated, would they respond? And they still didn't respond, showing that it wasn't because of the low dosage that they didn't respond. It was just simply because, just like many cancers don't respond to checkpoint inhibition, they were cold cancers when it came to checkpoint inhibition. And then off the back of this, there was this phase 2 study in kidney cancer showing comparing 0.3 and 2 and 10 mg per kg every 3 weeks. And basically you can see here the same level of efficacy in this randomized phase 2 study. But the drug that was taken forward to the larger registration trials was 3 mg per kg every 2 weeks. And showing, this was also from the PD-1 receptor occupancy. A picture tells 1,000 words. And here you can see the receptor occupancy is the same across all the different dosage levels. But the dosage taken forward was 3 mg per kg. You would think based on this, that why didn't they take the lower dosage? Well, I think they just didn't want to take any risk that they weren't getting a high enough dose. And there was no dose toxicity relationship really. And so they said, let's just give a higher dose so we can be absolutely certain we've given enough drug so that we don't take the risk of a drug not hitting its endpoint and not getting regulatory approval just because we tried to give too low a dose. So the dosage taken forward is a higher dosage, but we could see that the lower dosages were final. So this is work that we did together with people at the Cody Peer and Doug Figg from the NCI, then doing pharmacokinetic, pharmacometric modeling, looking at these dosages and seeing what you can do about if you spread out the interval. So here basically, this is the standard accepted dose, and this is the trough levels. And the green line is basically the target trough, which we identified as the target trough from if you're giving 0.3 mg per kg. And so how much does that target, how much drug do you really need? So you can see that you're way above the trough. But what happens if we, instead of 480 every 4 weeks here, if we then spread it out and we say 480 every 8 weeks, okay? So this is twice the interval, giving half the drug, saving half the costs, and you can see that you've basically got everybody above the target trough level. So you've just saved half of the dose. Now, half of the expenditure. Now, here's all the mathematical stuff, which I haven't got a clue what any of that means. So off the back of that, we then designed this trial comparing giving standard dosing versus extended interval dosing, basically spreading out the interval, multiplying the interval by 2. This trial is now open in Chicago. It's supposed to be opening at Harvard. It is, I think there's talks going on in Canada. I think Kelvin Chan is leading those talks to try to get it open through your national networks in Canada. And so we would really welcome your interest in recruiting to this trial. And I can give you more details about this trial once it kind of gets open and up and running in Canada. There's, off the back of this, there's emerging retrospective data coming from many places in the world. There's a paper from Singapore. There's one from Russia, from St. Petersburg, showing, in these resource-poor countries where they just didn't have enough drug, they've been giving the drug at low levels and getting fantastic results in Hodgkin's disease. In nivolumab, they were giving 40 milligrams every 2 weeks, and they're getting like 80% response rates or something like that in these relapsed refractory Hodgkin's patients in St. Petersburg. Now, everybody likes to talk about personalized medicine. So here's personalized interventional pharmacoeconomics and the potential. Atezolizumab, I think this is my favorite checkpoint inhibitor. So the target trough as stated by the manufacturer is 6 micrograms per milliliter. But when they give it at the standard dosing, the first dose trough is 95, and the drug actually accumulates with time. That's one of the pharmacologic properties, that it accumulates. And so the steady state trough is 225. But the trough that you need is only 6. So you're way, way, way above the volume of drug that's actually required in the bloodstream. So there's potential for logarithmic dose reductions, but also the potential for personalized dosing. So what you can do here is that you can give the first dose, bring them back after 4 weeks, check their blood level, and then input it into the pharmacokinetic model or algorithm. And then for each individual patient, you can say, okay, you come back in 8 weeks for your next dose, you come back in 12 weeks for your next dose, and really have precise dosing and saving masses of money there. So you can also give it shorter duration, and we talked a little bit about this. This is the trial of the Persephone trial. There was a similar trial called the FAIR trial from France. 5,000 patients, about 4,000 or 5,000 patients each on these trials. Look at those graphs. You can't even see that there were. You can hardly see that there were two lines on each of those graphs. And yet, unfortunately, despite this looking absolutely the same, this hasn't really also been welcomed with open arms and hasn't really been brought into standard practice. There's been a bit of a statistical debate about the non-inferiority margins, which patients are safe, which ones aren't, as well as the clinical kind of, the landscape changing with regard to other drugs entering the landscape. And so this trial took, a number of years, took masses of patients, and unfortunately has had some impact, but limited. And so what I ask is, when you can see these graphs look like this, do we really need to look at the non-inferiority margins? And do we really need to talk statistically about all these different issues? Or can we just look at that and say, you know what, let's give 6 months instead of 12? So this is something about funding these trials. There's very little public money available these days to fund trials. Most of the money in oncology clinical trials now is industry related. But shouldn't the healthcare payers have an interest to fund these trials? So we went knocking on doors a number of times trying to find healthcare payers, say, look, if you run this trial, you might save them money afterwards. If you run the Herceptin trial, you stand to save money in 5 years' time. And I think it's that in 5 years' time, they're not always so interested, and it sounds a long way off, and they don't think long term as such. And healthcare payers don't really fund trials. But now, when you actually look at the numbers, it is actually worthwhile for a healthcare payer just to recruit patients to the trial, irrespective of the results, irrespective of if there's going to be a statistical debate at the end, irrespective of what the endpoint is or how long it'll take. Just recruiting patients on the trial will save money. So here's ibrutinib. We know that we can probably give about a third of the dose and reduce bleeding problems and heart problems. And you can use some of that savings from half of the patients getting a third of the dose. You can use some of those savings to run the trial. And even despite running the trial in a very comfortable financial way, there's still plenty of leftover money. So you can see here, enrolling 20 patients in a center, after funding the trial, the payer will save $1.3 million US just from recruiting patients to this trial. So this trial, we've tried to design it. We still haven't quite got there yet. But this is a financial model for running such a trial. And we've suggested actually that Canadian healthcare payers ought to be interested in this type of a financial mechanism to run such a trial. And if anybody from you have connections with the healthcare payers, perhaps Cancer Care Ontario, although the mechanism sounds complicated to me, then it makes sense just to set this up. Now, I think we're going to skip this. Needless to say, there's many diseases where there's potential for studying CML, myeloma, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatologic conditions. And that's that. So now let's move on to the anything else of interest with just a few minutes remaining. So here's a few slides I kind of just tacked on the end and cleaned out a little bit. And what I want to talk about is patient or population. Who are we here to serve? And you in Canada may think slightly different to the people south of your border, and you may think slightly differently to how people in Israel think, or British people, or different people. But so this is something that, as a result of my work, I started to ponder this very deeply. Am I here to serve the individual patient or the population? And as a result, we wrote this paper, and let me tell you, this was what I thought my best paper I had ever written. And it was the hardest paper to ever publish. It went to many places. The oncologist editor, I think, felt sorry for me, so accepted it. But I apologize to him now because this has 0 citations, even though I think it's the best thing I've ever written. So it comes from this. There was a couple of editorials or comments and controversies in JCO. This was, I think, maybe 10 years ago or so, arguing about this issue. And some oncologists saying, no, our responsibility is only to the patient in front of us. And others saying, no, we have to think about society. We need to think about the cost of drugs. We can't just be throwing drugs, irrespective of their costs, not caring about anything. And we need to take some responsibility for it. And so there are different philosophical viewpoints. And so the utilitarian approach, these are quotes from their articles, the utilitarian approaches that seek to maximize welfare at the societal level, include considerations of cost effectiveness, have tended to conflict with the respect for individual human dignity that permeates American political culture. And Aristotle said, the doctor does not treat humankind in general, but an individual who is sick. So these are two different viewpoints. And also, not only just oncologists or doctors, but also you can think about the attitudes of different clinicians within the healthcare system. And I think that specialists think very differently to GPs. And they have very different attitudes regarding gatekeeping and their responsibilities. A GP is essentially a gatekeeper, treats certain diseases, but is a gatekeeper and decides when to refer and when to do certain tests and when not to. Whereas many specialists feel they don't have any responsibility for being a gatekeeper, and they'll do every test that they want to possibly do to possibly rule out any rare possibility. So my hypothesis is, in fact, that doctors, policymakers, and patients are actually confused about the objective of healthcare, and they're actually confused about whether they are there to serve individuals or to serve a population. Because when I talk to them and try to ask them and pry, there's some level of discomfort and they're not quite sure. And then certain things conflict with each other. So there's these two major strategies. One's called population health, and you can go online and find all these nice symbols and icons and different things all about population health. And then there's something also called patient-centered care, and there's the patient-centered care organizations with all the different strategies and how to give it. And they're nice buzzwords, but in my opinion, the strategies are often in conflict. And so here's some clinical examples. If you take a patient with a headache, let's say a 40-year-old lady comes into the GP's practice tomorrow and has a headache. Now, we're taught in medical school and in training to look for red flags, different problems, or, try to assess, could it be a tension headache? Even if you think it's most likely just a tension headache, can you with certainty know that it's not a metastasis from a new breast cancer that's metastasized to the brain? And I would argue that you can't. And if we wanted to, and if that patient was very anxious and wants everything patient-centered care with regard to her values, then she might want to be certain, and she might want an MRI. And so from an individualist perspective, you would send that patient, as well as many patients, for an MRI, whereas using a populational perspective, we try to gatekeep and prevent overusage of MRIs, because most likely it's going to be negative, although there are these rare, unusual cases which do crop up and do present like that. And so to be certain, you would do an MRI. Now, next generation sequencing across the board in cancer is another good example. Obviously, lung cancer, it's a good idea to do sequencing to find the relevant mutations, but certain other cancers where the likelihood of finding a genuinely actionable mutation may be low, let's say pancreas cancer, for example. And if we do it across the board, unlikely to find anything that's really going to help with treatment. But maybe there's BRCA these days that you could check for. Questionable how much effect the PARP inhibitors really have in BRCA positive pancreas cancer. But But then, but if we're just going to say, well, no, but what about if they have an NTRK mutation? And now the chance is extremely low, and then if they did have it, they could get larotrectinib. But should we spend all the money on doing all this sequencing on lots and lots and lots of patients where the chance is low and the populational impact of doing this is probably pretty minuscule? Whereas from an individual perspective, from an individual patient who sits in the clinic, almost everybody would like to have it done. Now, here's another example. Well, actually, I think we can skip this one. We can skip that. So my hypothesis is that people are kind of confused, don't really know if we're aiming to treat the individual or the population. But I think we need to understand what our underpinning philosophy is before doing complex clinical or economic research. If we're practicing population health, then I would argue, why are we doing research for rare diseases? Why would we invest in specialist services for rare diseases? The USA Orphan Drug Act is an interesting example. Obviously, the USA is much more individualistic, but if you say, no, we care about population health, that's what our system is here to support, then one would argue that there wouldn't be any reason for encouraging research or specialist services for rare diseases, which is a difficult concept to accept, but that's basically what it would mean. Now, if you're practicing patient-centered healthcare, why don't we just, in America, sometimes you still can't always get an MRI or a PET scan without some type of bureaucratic hurdle. So why not just accept that you're practicing patient-centered healthcare, open the floodgates, let the GDP rise beyond 17% expenditure on healthcare and let it go up to 50% and say, well, that's what we're willing to do. I would argue that many policy decisions are currently not fully clear what the underpinning philosophy is driven by. Sometimes they're driven by politics, sometimes they're driven by historical reasons, and sometimes they're driven by simply the presence of expertise. But most decisions in life and medicine are about trade-offs. So the trade-off of a purely population-centered approach is that some lives will be lost, lives with rare diseases, patients with, let's say, NTRK mutations will be lost because those won't be identified. But people will not be able to receive any test or treatment that they request. But the budget will be controlled and maintained. However, the trade-off of kind of a purely individualistic base way, a patient-centered approach, is that it will cost more money. It's quite simple to do it that way. It will cost a tremendous amount more money. And society will have to pay for doing it that way, and it comes in the form of higher taxes or insurance premiums. And you can see this playing out in the US right now, and that's what they're stuck with. And I think America is individualistic. I would argue that Britain was more societal. Where I live now in Israel, I would argue that we used to be societal. We had these kibbutz systems. But we're moving more to the individualistic way, more to the American way, where they want, everybody wants everything. They all want next generation sequencing. Everybody wants a PET scan or an MRI at every possible moment. And okay, that's an acceptable way to view it. But society will have to accept that this is going to cost a significant amount of money. I don't have any real answers to all of this, and I'm challenged daily and tormented daily by it, but I'm comforted by this quote by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said, "The whole world is a very narrow bridge, but the important thing is not to fear at all." And with that, I close.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was an excellent talk. It was quite enlightening, very philosophical. So how do you manage in your daily life between, you have both the roles, you put on two hats as a public payer controller and seeing patients in a clinic. How do you do it?
With a tremendous amount of torment and genuine struggle. I think from a practical perspective, when all the clinic, first of all, I try to respect clinical patient's needs in front of me in the clinic and wants. And if evidence supports something, even though the evidence may be weak, then try to respect it. But I'm also and kind of flow with the patient, but also strongly try to communicate certain things which may not always be communicated about. Even though a drug might be available, the toxicity might be high and the suffering may be high with the drug as well. I try to practice as an efficient clinician. I'm not always sure, as a kind of not cost-conscious clinician, but a careful, thoughtful clinician, but without withholding things from patients that I see as important. In a policy perspective, it's a little bit different. When you're working with a fixed budget and there's overuse going on, then I have to try to find ways of trying to implement some certain types of controls. I'm not really giving you a very straight answer, but I think my answer is that I deal with it with a tremendous amount of torment, heartache, and also hatred or anger from colleagues sometimes, from colleagues and friends.
Dr. Myron has a raised hand.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much, Dr. Goldstein, for your talk. I appreciate it. My question here is related to aiming high.
Right.
What brings to mind here is Dr. Dan Peer, who's chair of Tel Aviv Cancer Biology Research Center. Also Dr. Jiva from the Tel Aviv Suralsky Medical Center and the Sheba Medical Center. And these individuals are moving towards using cannabis as a treatment for probably to bring down the adverse side effects of the chemotherapeutics, but also maybe as a treatment for cancer. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so Israel has been moved forward in this field of using cancer in the field of oncology. There's some thought that the cancer in cannabis in high doses has an anti-cancerous effect. I think that the data to support that is very weak. Cannabis is used in our departments. I work closely with one of our palliative care doctors, who's excellent, Shimon Vine, and it seems to be that it can have a good effect for some patients, more for palliative reasons, anxieties, pains, that type of thing, as opposed to anti-neoplastic effect.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Dan, that was a phenomenal talk. Thank you so much. If I was on Twitter, I'd be going ballistic right now, but instead I just pulled out my cell phone and I used a text message to tell a few friends it was awesome. Yeah, you hit on so many things that drive us crazy. I mean, I usually look at the world through the problem with marginal effect sizes, but I really appreciate the work and your colleagues are doing to look on the other side of that, which is just how to mitigate some of the problems in the system by these really creative, innovative ideas. And so I guess I just wanted to push a little bit more on, it's always blown my mind that the Ministry of Health and Cancer Care Ontario will not invest $3 to $5 million to fund a de-escalation randomized trial when we're spending, tens and tens of millions of dollars per year on these expensive therapeutics. And now that you're on the inside working with kind of these large kind of decision-making organizations, I just want to, hear a little bit more about that. And I guess just a second comment would be, I really liked your really pushing on those two apparently competing philosophies in the last few slides. And you'll be pleased to say your citation index just went up by 1. So now it's 3. It looks like a great paper. But one of the issues, Dan, in our field is that our treatments sometimes are so marginal in benefit that we're really not compromising the patient's outcome by, quote unquote, denying them these therapies because they're not available or too expensive. And so I guess that helps me sleep at night as a clinician who I think probably practices in a similar tormented philosophy to you. So I guess just wanted to hear a little bit more of your thoughts about, in particular, about trying to get ministries of health and payers to be part of this process.
So I hear you entirely. With regard to getting the payers involved, now that I have connections with the inner hierarchy of Clalit, which I didn't have before, where I've managed to get a theoretical green light that we can run some of these trials, particularly as, and I think what's really crucial is the fact that if you can convince them, the fact that it doesn't matter what the results are, they don't care about saving money 5 years down the line. And rightfully, they think, oh, who knows if the trial will be positive or not. And I agree. I don't even know what happens if you run a trial and then someone argues about the endpoint or whatever. I agree. But now, if you do the math properly and you pick a trial that that can just make money, not even cost neutral, that can actually make money. So I would push you towards that. It's in healthcare, Health Affairs blog where we wrote it, and it's got the math there. It's got that ibrutinib trial, and it's amazing. But it requires penetrating into the inner echelons of where these decision makers are and making friends with them and doing it that way, because this is politics at the end of the day. It's personalities and things like that, and it requires getting into the organizations. What was your second question? Your second question?
No, just acknowledging that inherent tension between the societal perspective and individual. You're right. It's challenging. And if the treatments are really effective, then it's really problematic.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem sleeping at night with, not giving my metastatic bladder patients a fourth line of treatment. I have no problem sleeping at night. And I don't really have a problem sleeping at night because through the basket of services in Israel that I have access to all of the good therapies. Bad treatments like, these 6-week benefit things, I don't have access to, but I don't lose sleep about it. Now, I don't know how all of my colleagues view me, to be perfectly honest, around the country as well as within my own institution. I think they think I'm a death doctor sometimes. But I actually take great pride in trying to help patients have a good end of life, a good death. And I take huge pride in giving a patient and their family a good death, as opposed to a death ending up in the hospital connected to tubes. And I see the gratitude from patients when, even though they're not happy about a death, but I can see that I've helped them.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks for your talk, but also just for pushing the envelope in this area. There's a handful of people that are really leading this, and you're one of them. And so, our field's better off from it. Look forward to following it in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Patty Groom has a question.
Thank you. And I realize we're over time, but fabulous talk, but I couldn't help thinking that the drug companies, the pricing is, to some extent anyway, driven by the cost of the drug development. And if in a world where your strategy for interventional pharmacoeconomics became very successful, I can't help being cynical and wondering whether the drug companies would find a workaround.
Yeah.
So it might be a temporary solution is what I'm wondering if you've thought about that. So
I hear you entirely, and I agree with you entirely. This strategy is just a kind of, it's a strategy that might work for 10, 15, or might possibly have some impact for 10, 15 years before the drug companies then realize, oh, well, you know what, they better do their dose optimization properly before taking registration trials. Now, in the meantime, in the intervening 10, 15 years, if we have a strategy that works, there are a number of counter movements that they can do, in that they can change the way that the drug is priced, they can change the way the drug is packaged and different things like that. Depending on the healthcare system, sometimes they can't. So for example, in Israel, the price of a drug, once it's already approved into the basket of services, the price is locked. It can't increase. Whereas in America, the price is increased, and we've studied that, we published a paper on it, they just increase all the time. Usually they increase in small amounts. Now they could just jack up the price a lot. They actually tried to do that with ibrutinib because they put something out, they changed the way they were packaging the drug with ibrutinib, and then actually they got this thing into the Washington Post, and then the company retreated and then went back to it because they got public outcry. So public outcry and using the press can also have some impact. Who are we? Some few small researchers that probably don't care about this. So maybe not always that much impact.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Kevin Knopf, Dr. Kevin Knopf.
Yeah, hi, great talk. Two comments. First of all, I think that the duality of individual patient versus population can be a little bit answered in that the clinician can always make cost-effective choices for an individual patient, and we should talk more about that some other time because I want to get your thoughts there. For example, you don't need an MRI for myeloma. You could use a skeletal survey and you could save the money there. But I find that most of my residents and such don't think that way. They just try and order whatever test comes to mind. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about how financial conflict of interest could be dealt with. If you're an academic in the States, your career path is not usually like Vishal's and Chris Booth's. It's usually you get a tumor type and your goal is to enroll patients on clinical trials and get your names on those papers. And I know, for example, at Oregon Health Sciences University, they're paid 1% of their salary every time they enroll somebody on a clinical trial. So this may be why there are a lot of people on one side and very few people doing the kind of work you do. Do you think there's some sort of solution for a financial conflict of interest that could be embedded over the next 5 to 10 years?
The honest answer is no, I'm not sure we have any clear solution. I think that this is the system that we have at the moment. I mean, it would be nice if universities changed how they viewed stuff and there was more public funding supporting research with public funding as opposed to only industry funding. It would be nice if investigators wrote their own papers as opposed to ghostwritten papers. And it would be nice if trainees were taught really kind of more genuine types of science as opposed to the kind of stuff that's pushed by the pharmaceutical industry, sometimes through the mouths of some of the PIs. But I think this is a situation that we have at the moment. I don't see any clear path out of it at the moment. Not anything that I can, that I'm able to do.
Well, you serve as a beacon, so we hand out your papers and such. Say this is the way you can be.
Yeah, Kevin, I just sent you a link. You raise a good point, right? The medical system celebrates these kind of arcane, diagnoses, right? So I'm sure when young Dr. Goldstein was an intern and on rounds and someone came in to emerge with a headache, he probably just wanted to tell the attending it's probably a migraine, but he would have got 4 gold stars if he said it could be lupus cerebritis. We should do a lumbar puncture, right? So we kind of celebrate these, weird things in training that I think perpetuate some of this overuse of diagnostics. And then you're right, there's a whole number of reasons why there's an overuse of therapeutics, probably because it's often easier to prescribe 4th-line regorafenib than to sit down and have the honest conversation that really should happen.
Right. So, the young Dr. Goldstein, I still specifically remember when I was doing my emergency medicine rotation in Hull Royal Infirmary in the north of England, that someone came in with a small fall and hit his head, and I remember the SHO, which was the resident, saying to the consultant in the ER, "Should I do a CT?" He said, "Yes, always do a CT, always do a CT." It stuck with me. It really stuck, and it was like, it's such a dogmatic way to think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially thank you, Dr. Goldstein, for making time and sharing such very important, interesting, even philosophical questions in oncology with us. It has been a real pleasure, and I hope you'll join us again.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Thanks, Dan. Enjoy your camping trip.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Hi. I recognize we're over time, but can I just ask you a quick question, Dr. Goldstein?
Sure.
So I think it was a brilliant presentation. You showed 2 very different points of view. I know that Israel, in general, it's pretty an effective, a very efficient country in many ways. And maybe what is applicable there may not be applicable in other countries. Can you just briefly comment, because you've been in UK, you're in Israel now. Can you briefly comment on what the healthcare system is like in Israel?
Sure. Yeah, so we have a nationalized healthcare system, a somewhat nationalized healthcare system, or at least the coverage is nationalized, where everybody has access to basic medical health services, and they sign up to one of the 4 HMOs. Clalit, which is where I work, covers 55% of the population, and there's another 3 HMOs that also provide the coverage, provide primary care and funding and support for all the other types of all the medical conditions and hospitalizations and drugs. It's somewhat efficient. It's somewhat bureaucratic, some people complain about. What's interesting is that I live in a town with a lot of Americans as well as a lot of British immigrants. And obviously, me being British and living in the States for 9 years, I talk to different friends and people from these different countries. And they're immigrants from these countries. And universally, the British people all love the Israeli healthcare system, whereas the American immigrants all don't like it. Now, why? Because the British come from also a nationalized healthcare system where the coverage is sometimes a little bit inefficient, sometimes a little bit slow, but they usually get what they need, but they get it in a bit more of an efficient way, a bit more quickly in Israel. And so they like the American healthcare system. The American immigrants, who are generally well educated, relatively comfortable financially, have come from a system of having very high quality insurance in America because they're part of the upper echelons of society, and they're used to this idea of being able to choose their doctor, being able to see their doctor tomorrow, being able to get any drug they want, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden they come to a system where, oh no, it's a socialized system where they might have to wait, they can't quite choose their doctor, etc., etc. So they don't like it. So I think Israel is somewhat the middle ground between these two countries that I've come from. Having worked in different countries, people ask me, oh, which healthcare system do you think is the best? And I answer everybody, there is no best healthcare system because every healthcare system has individual trade-offs. And so for some places, the trade-off is that you have you have more services, but it costs more. Others, the access is better. Others, some patients are covered and some aren't, like in America. And so there's trade-offs everywhere. I don't think there's any perfect system in the world. I do think that you live in, being Canadian, or being in Canada, you have a somewhat, I'm quite impressed by everything I hear from Canada, I have to say.
Yeah, no, what your comments about immigrants coming from UK and US is a very, I'm sorry to keep you. I just find this very interesting because I'm not originally from Canada. I come originally from Argentina, which has a similar system than US, except for healthcare workers don't make as nearly as much money as in US, and we work significantly longer hours than we do than people here. So I come from a different perspective, and everything is relative. And what you're pointing out, it's very true. Someone that comes from US who that is what all he knows, suddenly to go to Israel and maybe have to wait 3 weeks to see a specialist, he goes crazy. Or someone that comes from UK that has to wait for 6 months. And in Israel, the waiting time, I'm not sure what the wait times are to see a specialist, but maybe it's only a month or 2 months. Then they say, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. So everything is relative in terms of what you're comparing with and what is. But I have family in Israel, and my understanding is that Although no one is going to, you are not going to be able to please everybody all the time. That's by definition. My knowledge is that considering is a socialized or a universal healthcare, if you want to put it somehow, it's pretty efficient. And to be honest, it's from things I have read and heard. I have people living in Germany, in UK, in US, we have family all over the world. And we hear that Israel is probably one of the most efficient.
It's a good place. I agree. It's a good place. It's a good place. Okay. Anyway, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldstein, for making time today and staying beyond the time. Thank you.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye everyone.
Bye.